Welcome today our two individuals who will represent perspectives of the two candidates. They both want me to be very clear that they are not officially representing the campaigns or the candidates, but they both have long and close ties to the two camps and know their positions well and will reflect them well, I'm sure. So first, I'd like to introduce, to take the position on the left here, Professor Bill Burke-White, who is Deputy Dean and Professor of Law at the University of Pennsylvania School of Law, and has most recently, between 2009 and 2011, served as a member of the policy planning staff at the U.S. State Department in the Obama administration under Secretary Clinton. And there, among many other things, he was the principal drafter of the administration's Quadrennial Diplomacy and Development Review. So a very important document that sets out this administration's foreign policy priorities and approach. Bill, go ahead and assume the position there. Welcome. And then on the right here, I'd like to welcome Ambassador Pierre Prosper, who is currently of counsel at Arent Fox, but previously served in a number of positions in public life as a prosecutor here in the United States, as a prosecutor at the Rwanda Tribunal, and as the ambassador at large for war crimes issues in the Bush administration. So he has also been an advisor to the Romney campaign, and as I say, we'll be representing that perspective here. And I'm going to play Gwen Ifill in the middle. So welcome. Our format is going to be relatively informal, debate style. I'm going to pose some questions to each of the two representatives, hopefully try to find the fault lines and spark a little debate between them. And after we have 3 or 4 questions and discussion of those among us, we'll open it up to the floor and welcome your questions as well. And I understand, timekeepers, that we are allowed to go a little bit over, so indulge us. We're only allotted 30 minutes, so we have lots to talk about. Let me start with a general kind of framing question about the candidate's approach to presidential power and foreign policy. And I'll start with you, Bill. We've had a lot of discussion today, and this has been a critique that we've heard elsewhere too, that in terms of exerting the presidential authority in foreign affairs, many have characterized the Obama administration as representing more similarities to the prior Bush administration than difference. Do you think that that's a fair and accurate characterization? And would you expect to see any difference in a second Obama administration? Are we going to have a little bit more flexing of muscles with the freedom when we don't face re-election, or will the president be the ultimate lame duck?
So thanks for the question. And 4 years ago, it was great fun, right? We were on all these policy teams, dreaming up policy for then Senator and candidate Obama. Now, as Pierre and I were just remarking, I'm constrained because I am, in a sense, representing administration policy, because that is, in fact, the president's campaign platform, which does sort of narrow how one can respond on some of these issues. I would also say that 4 years ago, I was perhaps more of a naive academic who could tell you all of the reasons that presidential power was too inflated and was a dangerous thing. And then I got to government and quickly said, well, where is that presidential power we thought the Bush administration had? And realized that there's an awful lot more constraint than perhaps as academics we had once argued. So that, again, kind of constrains me. Jack Goldsmith this morning, I think, answered that question better than perhaps I possibly could. But let me try to focus on the question of what we might see differently going forward. And I think the things that will drive possible differences are less internal, less policy shifts than they are external. And I would point to 3 specific things that might lead to changes in how the president approaches presidential authority in foreign policy making. The first is the fact that we have enormous gridlock in Capitol Hill. And that makes it much more difficult than it was, I don't want to say in the past 4 years, because I think there's been some continuity, but certainly looking further back in terms of ways one can work with Congress. And I think the president, as he said last night, is eager to work with Congress, but it's awfully hard to do so. That means that when choices like Libya come along, the thought of going to the Hill is a real difficult binding constraint if one takes the approach that that's necessary. So partisan politics and where that goes, I think, will to some degree frame the president's approach. Second is technology, and this is something we've heard a lot about today, but the changes in technology, whether it is in terms of surveillance or drones, all shift the kind of frameworks of thought about where those presidential authorities lie and where Congress needs to be involved, and means that some of the existing legislation is probably outdated. And that's not to say that we need to therefore ignore it, but that how we collectively respond to those technology changes may shape that response. And finally is external events. That's not to say that the president will completely shape his view based on those events, but 9/11 was a fundamental shift. And to the degree that we see changes in the external environment, that may also shape to some degree what occurs in the next 4 years. I think ultimately this is a president who has and will continue to talk about limits on the executive, but I think that Jack was very much right this morning to say there are elements of continuity, not with the Bush administration of 2004, but certainly with the Bush administration of 2008. So I'll stop there and turn it over.
Okay. Pierre, if I can turn to you and ask you to look in your crystal ball and tell us what President Romney would do in terms of his general approach to presidential prerogatives in this area.
Well, thank you. First, it's a pleasure for me to be here. And as Betsy said, I do work with the Romney campaign, but here today I'm speaking as an observer and in my personal capacity. You know, I agree. I'm going to start off by agreeing. You know, with Bill, who's known for a long time and is a friend, regarding the factors that will influence the next president's decision on how to use power. But what I want to do is, rather than getting into some of the legal points, I want to give you a little bit of the mindset of the governor, which will help you understand a bit how he may choose to exercise this power. And the way to do it a little bit is to contrast with President Obama. Now you hear the governor say a lot that he wants America to lead, and we hear a lot about this leadership. The United States should be out there leading, and I was thinking about it on the way here. How do you define leadership? Does it mean that we need to be out there, the pointy end of the stick, if you will, on military engagements, or what else does it mean? And where the governor is coming from, and you see it in his book, No Apologies, is that he's looking for America to set the tone. He's looking for America to set the agenda. It's not that we need to be out in front from the military perspective, but we need to guide the way. I know my predecessor, Ambassador Sheffer, can speak to this, but oftentimes when you travel around the world, nations want to know, where does the United States stand? What is the United States' position on something? Now, they may not agree, but it gives them the ability to then react. And now the criticism that the governor has of President Obama is that leadership, as I just described, is lacking. It is almost a preference not to use some of the presidential powers and authorities that he has externally to really shape the policy, shape the agenda of the world. Now, the other thing that the governor believes in is, you hear a lot about, obviously he wants to increase the Navy and the military, but he does talk a lot about soft power and the rule of law. And again, I recommend you look at that chapter in his book, because he believes that soft power is critical. In order for soft power to be effective, you need hard power. They go hand in hand. So when you have hard power, soft power is credible, and vice versa. So he wants to get out there, promote the rule of law for the obvious reasons that we know, but also for economic reasons, to build a better environment for American businesses and Americans as they travel. Now, that's not the deep into some of the legal weeds that you've all been getting in today, but it gives you a sense of the mindset and where things may go.
Okay, great. Let me follow up then with you, Pierre, and we've talked a fair amount, particularly this morning, about presidential powers and the balance of powers between the president and Congress in war powers. And there was a fair amount of critical discussion about the Obama administration and its failure to, its stretching of the AUMF to exert power beyond perhaps the original intent in the post 9/11 period, and also its failure to go back to Congress to get authorization under the War Powers resolution for its operations in Libya. There was also a fair amount of discussion that was maybe, again, more continuity than change in recent years. But what can we expect from a Romney administration in terms of that division of labor between Congress and the presidency? And perhaps President Romney would have a more welcome reception in Congress, and would that make a difference in the approach?
Well, it may, and I think the key here is the engagement with Congress, and I think you can expect to see Governor Romney engage on these issues. Now, whether he'd be successful depends on the makeup of the Congress and how the relationships form, but I think you can expect to see this because he does believe in building that type of consensus to go forward, or driving the consensus to go forward. However, that said, I think every president, every candidate that's become president recognizes that once you're in office, you begin to look at some of the legal tools available to you, and there's a natural or inherent tension or sometimes disagreement with the Congress. So that's not to say that he would not decide, if he believes he's on solid legal footing, to go in a particular direction. But his goal is to try to unite us into a common direction so that, again, it makes America stronger and more prosperous.
Okay. And Bill, what about a second Obama administration? Do we have a AUMF 2.0 coming?
Let me talk about Libya first, which is to say, obviously I will cite you to Harold Koh's excellent testimony on this question if you're asking about a question of what the administration policy is on it. But fundamentally, I was in government when we were making the decisions about how we were going to respond in Libya. And I watched the United States move about 180 degrees in policy in about 1 week's time. And that was driven by a perception of an urgent necessity to respond to a situation on the ground. And this is a president who, when he sees a situation where he believes that America's interests and values are imperiled, will say, what is the right set of tools available to us to solve that? He did so in a way that he believed was fully in keeping with the War Powers Resolution, and in a limited and constrained way that both saved lots of lives on the ground in Libya and protected America's interests in the region. I think that's how the president is going to address those questions going forward. This is not someone who wants to intervene, and we've seen with our hesitance to move into Syria in any military sense, that he's not going to immediately look toward a military solution, but he's one who's going to be willing to do so even when he realizes there are domestic political costs of doing that. And I think he realized that the costs of having to try to get a congressional resolution on this were sufficiently great that it made sense to have a more limited U.S. engagement that still achieved our objectives. And I think this is a president who's really willing to take those bold decisions when they're needed, even if there are political costs there. Will we look to a different approach going forward? Frankly, I think we have to, because technology is going to make the way these kinds of lower level, more limited conflicts get dealt with very different, right? If one is thinking about the use of the internet or the use of drones in ways that don't imperil American lives directly, that may take one outside of the scope of much of the War Powers Resolution, and therefore we may need a different approach going forward, one that I hope also can be built on a bipartisan consensus, but one where I'm not sure I'm seeing that consensus emerge.
Betsy, if I can just jump in, and this is more of a question to, hopefully it'll stimulate a little debate. Bill, I hear you about Libya, but I'm puzzled about Syria. Mm-hmm. I really am, because when you look at the president's speech for Libya, and I'm paraphrasing, he says, I cannot sit idly by and watch atrocities and massacres take place before my eyes. I need to do something. And then when we look at Syria, the numbers are over 20,000 people killed in 18 months, and the president is doing just that. He's sitting there just idly by watching, and his response is, well, let me issue more sanctions. Maybe maybe that will do it. Now, I'm not advocating military action, but one would guess that there are other presidential tools and powers available to him where we could stop picking up the paper every day and hear that 500 people were massacred. I don't know if you have thoughts on that.
So I think with any of these kinds of conflicts, one has to balance a couple of things, right? One is, what is America's interest in the conflict or in the region? And sometimes that's about American values, and that's something President Obama believes in just as strongly, if not stronger than Governor Romney, which is where you started. But at times, those are going to be balanced against the risks to other American interests, to American lives on the ground if you had to have a military action on the ground, and certainly to our broader interests in the region. I can't say exactly what other powers might have been being used in Syria. I can say a little bit about Libya because it's more of that is sort of out in the open now. But we sat at the State Department and worked very hard across the interagency to figure out not just how do we put sanctions on Gaddafi's regime, but how do we get financing to the rebels that make sense? But how do we also make sure that rebels don't gain access to weapons that might eventually be used against us? So there's a set of balancing there that makes it very hard to proclaim a simple principle. I do know that President Obama is not simply standing by saying, I wish we could do things. There are some things that I think we are doing. I personally would love to see us do more, but that's about, again, balancing those sets of interests. And I think any U.S. president is going to have to make those kind of balancing calls.
If I can jump in, it seems pretty clear that one constraint on action in Syria is in the Security Council and opposition on the part of China and Russia to robust Security Council action that the Obama administration has taken as a kind of a hard stop on what they can do. Would a Romney administration similarly look for Security Council authorization before acting in a situation like this?
Well, I think you would see a Romney administration address or go to the Security Council, but not be bogged down by indecision in the Security Council. And I think that there comes a point in time, and finally I think this administration, after 18 months, realized that the Security Council wasn't working and is beginning to look at things outside of the Security Council process. I think you would see some things, actions like that much sooner in a Romney type of administration, and I think you would see action as we saw with Kosovo or whatever it may be. When you realize that we're not getting any play in the Security Council, let's see if we can get the folks in the region together to take action.
No disagreement there, essentially. I think we have gone to the Security Council on Libya and were extraordinarily effective in getting Resolution 1973 through, and that the approach there was very much to bring together the region, go to the Gulf Cooperation Council, go to the African Union, and get the support in the region that then you can use in the Security Council to move the agenda there. Syria is harder because, frankly, Russia and China are deeply opposed, and there you have a much greater question of, do you violate or truly step beyond the council, or do you try to use it? And do you try to look for other ways where you don't need a Security Council resolution? And I think that's been the Obama administration's approach, and I think would be where the Security Council is blocked, to look for alternative mechanisms that don't require defying the council itself.
Okay, I'm going to switch to a new topic where I think there's probably even greater difference between the candidates, and that is Guantanamo detentions. Or at least in principle, there has been in the rhetoric. President Obama made a point, first day in office, of issuing an executive order aimed at closing Guantanamo. We heard and discussed earlier today how that's proven somewhat more difficult than was anticipated, in no small part because of opposition on the part of Congress. But what has the administration learned from that experience, and would we see a push forward or some new strategy to close Guantanamo in a second administration?
So the first thing I would say is, while the president did come in with the goal of closing Guantanamo Bay, the administration has actually, I think, done a rather remarkable job of decreasing the number of people in Guantanamo Bay, releasing those who could be released, finding other countries willing to take them, such that the numbers have significantly diminished. And I think we all underestimated the challenge of making those determinations and finding countries willing to accept Guantanamo detainees. but through a lot of hard work and a lot of diplomatic effort, significant strides have been made. I don't think those strides have gone far enough, and I think it will continue to be a goal to figure out what to do with the remaining 160 or so people who are in Guantanamo Bay. Some of them will be tried now, obviously, under military courts in Guantanamo Bay. It's unfortunate that the option of trying them under U.S. domestic law, which has proved very effective for a whole range of terrorist cases, is not on the table because of congressional legislation. I don't think you'll hear President Obama make any grand commitments to a date for closure of Guantanamo Bay, but I think there will be an ongoing process to try to reduce the numbers of people there in ways that fully conform with the Constitution, with due process, and with international law. And I think you've seen some significant reforms and changes in those processes to do that. I also think, and this came up earlier today as well, that you're seeing shifts in how one deals with the decisions to do you apprehend people, when do you apprehend them, and what do you do with them, so that hopefully we don't find ourselves in a position where Guantanamo Bay starts to grow again. And I think we've been quite successful at that. That doesn't mean necessarily using targeted killings, but it does mean asking, when is there a reason to detain someone rather than simply detain them and then ask later.
Okay. Pierre, let's hear about Governor Romney's perspective. He's historically been a staunch supporter of U.S. detention at Guantanamo. During the 2008 campaign, was on the record as saying he thought it should be doubled, the detention there. What would be his approach to Guantanamo specifically and to detention of future suspects in efforts to combat terrorism?
Well, I think first we need to face the reality. The reality is there will be detentions, either by President Obama or President Romney. And in fact, I'm sure if we scratch the surface a little bit, we'd realize that the United States government is involved in detention policies, detention issues around the world. It may not be Guantanamo. Guantanamo became a cause célèbre. It became very visible. But yeah, I can say with some assurance or comfort that I'm sure that there's detention still taking place in various parts of the world. Now, recognizing that there will be detention, the idea is, okay, if we're going to have these detentions, let's have a facility where you can do so, and that was the idea behind what Governor Romney has been saying. But what I find interesting with President Obama is I don't think you'll hear him say anything on Guantanamo, because ever since his first day in office, when he realized he wasn't going to close it, he stopped talking about it. Now, if you think about, and Bill, yes, the administration has been able to diminish the population slightly, but not greatly. When I was in the Bush administration, the population rose to about 750. We were able to get out 500 detainees, 500 of those, and you know how that happened? And none of them came to the United States. What it was hardcore diplomacy where the president, the national security advisor, secretary of state, myself would get out there. Every time a foreign leader who had a national in Guantanamo came, we would sit them down and say, we want to send this person back. What will it take? Let's work out an arrangement. You're not seeing that from this president. This president decided what he wants to do is he's not going to do the heavy lifting. He defers to the bureaucracy with hopes that they'll find a problem, either a willing nation, somewhere in North Africa, or try to bring them into the United States. So I don't expect that you hear him talk about that. The other thing, and I won't add a comment to this, but what the president is doing is, and I'm going to contradict myself by saying we're involved in some detention policies. But what he's doing, he's not detaining. He's killing them. I mean, let's be honest with these drone attacks. Those are the type of people who would have been detained before. So instead, these drones are going, and they're identifying terrorists using the same intelligence that has been used for detaining people in Guantanamo. And instead of bringing them and having the opportunity to either interrogate to collect intelligence or find out you were wrong, they're being killed. So it's, I'm not sure what will happen in an Obama administration. I think a Romney administration would recognize that there's a need for some sort of a detention policy, and that would be flushed out.
Can I follow up and ask, do you anticipate that a Romney administration would shift the calculus between detention and drones that we currently have?
Well, that's I haven't talked to the governor directly about this, but I think that when you look at these type of issues, you need to recognize, obviously, the threat that these individuals pose, but you also should recognize the value that is derived by the detention, having a detention policy where you can collect credible intelligence that will help you decipher exactly what may or may not be happening. And it also affords you the opportunity to correct your mistake if you are wrong. So I think all these things will be examined.
Okay. Bill, follow up?
So I have to disagree with you on one point, which is the question of, does President Obama sit by and let the bureaucracy try to work out how to get people out of Guantanamo Bay? Maybe Secretary Clinton is the bureaucracy, but I have sat in a number of meetings with Secretary Clinton and heads of state in which she did exactly the kind of hard diplomacy you're talking about. The problem is largely that the people who were left in Guantanamo are either from countries where you cannot repatriate them, say Yemen, or at least it's very difficult to repatriate them, or where there is a real risk of release, and that's the question of then what do you do with them, right? So I think both clearly Governor Romney and President Obama are willing to use a hard push, as was the Bush administration, to get that done. But Secretary Clinton, I have watched do it absolutely brilliantly. So on a personal level, I have to respond on that question. And I do think in terms of the question of the balance between detention and the use of targeted killing, there have been, and I think will continue to be, shifts in the Obama administration approach based on the kinds of intelligence you have and the circumstances, and also where the individuals are. Sometimes detention may be the right option, but then we have to make sure it's done in a way that fully accords with due process, as President Obama has indicated. And sometimes when you're in a battlefield situation, a drone attack may be the right option to pursue. And I think either candidate is going to engage in a balancing there to make those determinations.
Okay, I'm going to ask one last quick question and then open it up to the floor. Shifting gears again and coming back to our last panel, and I have to agree with Melissa Waters. I think Medellin's fascinating case, and I couldn't resist coming back to it here. And I'll put this one first to Pierre. We know the Medellin situation, and we had a lot of discussion about the implications for self-executing treaties in the last panel. What I'd like to come back to is, what do we do with the Avena judgment now? We're still in non-compliance. Everyone agrees that this is an obligation of the United States government. Bush administration agreed, the Supreme Court agreed, the Obama administration has agreed with this, but has not been able to do anything about it. What would a Romney administration do to bring us into compliance with the Avena judgment?
Well, here too, this specific issue has not have not had a conversation with the governor. But what I would expect is that if presented with this issue and said we need to meet our obligations, I think he would basically follow what the Supreme Court said and engage Congress and try to push this through to make it happen. That last panel was very fascinating for me to hear all the varying views, and as I think about it, I think about what Melissa was saying. I personally like this dualistic type of approach, because I think it's important to engage our Congress and the Senate on these issues. They need to understand that when they ratify a treaty, what the obligations are that accompany that treaty, and ensure that the appropriate legislation is in place to make it happen. Because we just don't want to have a rubber stamping of a treaty and then find ourselves in a situation where we are in conflict. In fact, one of the biggest problems that we see internationally on these treaties, and Dave Sheffer again can speak to this with the ICC, it's something that we've talked about. The United States generally, when we sign and ratify a treaty, we only do so when we know we're going to be able to fulfill the obligations. If we think we can't, then we don't sign or ratify. There are plenty of countries out there that will do it. They'll sign it, ratify it, so they can say, "Oh, we have all these international instruments that we're a party to. Aren't we a great nation?" So what I think you will see is an understanding of a very analytical approach to these things. He would look at it and say, well, we are a party, we've signed these various treaties, whatever it may be. If there's a role for Congress that needs to, they need to act upon it in order so that we can meet our obligations, I would expect that he would push hard for congressional action.
And Bill, the Obama administration hasn't been able to do that on Capitol Hill. It's had some other priorities. Would it be a priority in a second administration?
I think it would be a priority, probably not the #1 priority in the international legal space. President Obama is someone who is deeply committed to international law. It's something he thinks about, knows about, and always has a voice at the table for. He's also a president who says, how can international law best serve American interests? And the answer to that might be, and I think if you look at what we've done in the international legal space over the past few years, may well be to say, let's do everything we can to make sure that the START treaty gets ratified with Russia because that protects American interests. Let's try to get the Senate to ratify the Convention on the Law of the Sea because that will serve American interests. Let's try to get the Disability Convention through because that will help American citizens. The question with the Avena judgment is, where does it sit in that kind of political hierarchy of what do you go to Congress and push for? And I think it's on the list, but I think what you will continue to see is the president to say, what are the things that we need to get through Congress that most directly serve the interests of the United States? And over the past few years, it's been things like START and like the Convention on the Law of the Sea, where the president has said, that's really got to be my #1 priority when I go push an international legal issue on the Hill. I do think that based on Avena and Medellin, every time we go to the Hill with a treaty, we're thinking even more explicitly about making sure that the implementing legislation that perhaps once upon a time didn't think was necessary is there, and making sure that's part of the package. Unfortunately, with the House where it is, sometimes that can be a lot harder than we might like it to be.
Let me just jump in for a second. I'm no expert on this, so what I could say right now could be completely wrong. So I'll say this, but when you're looking at the prioritization of this, I don't know if I would put it up to the level of passing a treaty. Because what we're talking about is passing legislation. Mm-hmm. All we're asking for is for law enforcement that when you get a request, similar to a Miranda, you have to allow this person to make that phone call. So that should be a easy piece of legislation to pass through. The other aspect of it is it may not necessarily need to be congressional action. I mean, couldn't the president get out there, get the Justice Department to send an advisory opinion to all the states and try to get them to implement it into state legislation so that a police officer knows that this is what needs to occur?
President Bush tried that, and Texas didn't listen. So the broader question is one of how do you ensure compliance with an International Court of Justice decision, in that case barring an execution. I do think it's about figuring out ways to make sure that international legal norms percolate into our domestic system. Sometimes that's done best through an international treaty with implementing legislation, sometimes just through legislation, sometimes through presidential action or local law enforcement action. The difficulty is how do you ensure conformity across those things? And I think President Obama has thought about it that way, but has decided that this isn't the push to make on the Hill at the moment, and hopefully either candidate can find ways of going outside of Congress if need be.
I'm going to cut you off there and invite members of the audience to put some questions to our two representatives here for just a few minutes before we close up. Ben.
Hi, Ben Davis, University of Toledo. Question I had was with regards to the international rule of internal self-determination. There, in the Republican side, there's been consistently about 27 states now efforts to disenfranchise people from their voting rights so they won't vote this fall. And on the Democratic side, there have been some cases that have been filed to object to the Republican side. The results being that the Texas law passed by the Republicans was overruled recently. Down in Florida was overruled also, and efforts have been done here in Ohio also. So with regard to the right to vote of ordinary American citizens, what is the position of the Romney administration? Are they in favor of these laws that limit the right of internal self-determination that have been passed by lots of Republicans? And on the side of the Obama administration, with regards to the not prosecuting people for torture, what are you going to do in the next 4 years? Is that going to end now? Because we all know high-level civilians prosecuted, high-level civilians did the torture, ordered it right up to the President of the United States. Are we above the law too?
I'm going to actually pool all the questions and then let you have at them. So
I just had what I hope is a very simple question, really the same question for both sides. You know, this much ballyhooed reset with the Russians, and, you know, we've now seen some of the fruits of that reset, maybe not as much as the administration would have hoped. But of course, in Syria, we've seen that is not going to bear fruit. So my question for Bill would be, what comes of that? You know, you just continue trying to beat your head into the reset wall, or what do you do? And then with respect to Pierre, clearly in a new administration, there'll be a need to re-engage in some places. So you may not call it reset, do a different term. Where would you see as a key priority, based on what's happened this term, to say, we are weak in this area and we need to re-engage in a more forceful way that shows leadership?
okay, next.
John Quigley, Ohio State University. Does either the governor or the president consider that Israel's settlements in the West Bank are in violation of international law, and will they continue to provide aid to Israel if the settlements are maintained? And does either agree with the view expressed by General Petraeus in the Congress that our policy on Israel is an underlying cause of the terrorism that we face against the United States?
Okay, I'm writing these down, so I'll recap them.
Okay, good. Yeah. You can omit some. You know?
Okay. Does either candidate have any plans on ending the war soon? And if so, what are their plans to end the war so that American citizens can again have a peacetime economy and again have prosperity?
And just a point of clarification, you mean conflict in Afghanistan and withdrawing troops from Afghanistan, or more?
Everywhere. Can we just be a peaceful nation again? And I'm asking that question of both candidates.
Okay, so we've got voting rights, accountability for torture, reset with the Russians. What do you get or do with that? Israeli settlements and aid to Israel, views on the Petraeus statement about the support of Israel and its implications, and ending the war.
Who wants to go first?
Sure, I'll go first. Where's our guy left, the voter ID?
No, right in the middle.
Oh, there he is. There he is. You know, well, thank you for your question. I think, first of all, I'm not an expert on the laws that are being passed or pushed through in many of these states, but the principle behind it, I know you're saying it's to disenfranchise, but the idea is really more for a voter ID process, meaning identification when you come to vote. That's the basic of what these laws are supposed to be about anyway, is do you have an identification so that we can properly tie the right to vote with the person before you. Otherwise, if people come there without identification, there's room for fraud. Now, you may have examples of people being disenfranchised, and I'm not in a position to challenge that. But the notion that you require an identification for a voter should not be one that's troubling. Now, Michael Newton's question about Russia reset, where we're going to re-engage, I think you will see a re-engagement or different type of engagement across the world. I mean, Russia is a primary issue. Russia is obviously, if you look internally what they're doing, they're trampling on democracy and human rights. You see what they're doing to their neighbors, Georgia and others, using energy as a weapon, invading Georgia. The list can go on. We have to have a deeper and better engagement with China. The secretary, I applaud her, but she had a very, very difficult visit this week in China. It was basically she was reprimanded by the Chinese media and the vice president who refused to premier who refused to meet with her. Regarding Israel, you'll find, Governor Romney, and he said this, he'll be in full support of Israel. And the issue with the settlements deals with the issue of the borders and where you draw the line on the borders. But he will be, and has said that he's a staunch supporter of Israel. And I think you have to look at that, but also the states in the region have to accept their role and responsibility. I mean, you can't have Ahmadinejad sit there and say, we need to annihilate and kill the Jews. You just can't have it. That has nothing to do with the U.S. policy. That's Iran, making these statements. Lastly, peace. Yes, I think the United States can be a peaceful nation and should be a peaceful nation. And what the governor wants to do, what he believes is peace through strength. He wants to build enough of the hard power so that the soft power becomes effective, so we don't have to engage in these conflicts and we can return to the peaceful economy.
Okay, last word to Bill.
That's a lot of topics. I can't do them all, but let me start by saying in his national security strategy in 2010, President Obama laid out a vision of leadership, and it was a vision of global leadership that starts here at home. It starts by rebuilding America's economy and jobs and allowing us to be in a place to lead globally. We want to do that sort of leadership partly through stepping away from the military where you can, but also being strong where you need to be. That also means doing it smartly. It doesn't mean that you choose to go to war when there's not an American interest at stake or American values at stake, but it does mean that you position military forces where you need them to stay strong. And that's part of why President Obama has shifted some of our emphasis from the Middle East to the Asia Pacific so that we have more leverage with countries like China, where I think a lot of that focus is going to have to be. So it's not about saying we can't just withdraw from the world, because if we do, we're at risk around the world. We have to be engaged with the world very strategically and only use military force when we need to. In terms of the Russia reset, Michael McFaul, who was then the senior director at the National Security Council on Russia policy and now our ambassador there, I think was brilliant to reset that relationship. It was at an all-time low when President Obama came into office. The problem with a reset is it's binary. You flip the switch and you're done with the reset. So it's not a good linguistic hook for sort of a longer-term building of that relationship. I think we need to be asking ourselves with the Russians, what's the basis of that relationship going forward? What role does Russia see itself playing in Europe and in the world? And we want to make sure that role isn't one of using energy as a threat or invading neighbors or putting rock bands in jail because they criticize the Russian government. At the same time, Russia is a critical partner. It's a critical partner on Syria. It's a critical partner on trade. It's a critical partner with China. And so it's about finding the roots of that. And part of that means we need to do some things for the Russians so that they'll do some things for us. And we need to be able to say no to our friends, the Russians, when they do things like they have lately. So I think we need to kind of continue that and make it a process of reset where we also derive some benefit going forward. I see the stop time, but I can't let the Israel question just hang there, which is to say, President Obama, I think in his second term, will move the Israeli-Palestinian peace process front and center. It's something he cares deeply about, and it's something I think he'll be extraordinarily well positioned to do in his second term. That means being a good friend to Israel, who are our friends and have long been allies. It also, sometimes the best thing you can do for a friend is to say, actually, that's not such a smart idea, or actually, that's illegal. That doesn't necessarily mean they will always listen, but friendship is about helping us all find a course that can lead to ultimate peace and stability in the region, and I think that's what President Obama wants to do across the Middle East as the Arab Spring hopefully continues forward. So I'll stop there.
I'm going to jump in just because. No, I'm going to. Okay, I'm going to ask.
TV just closed off.
Well, it doesn't matter. We don't need TV. What has the reset gotten us? You say we have to do things for Russia to give us something in return. What have they given us? I mean, what can we point to? They're fighting us with Iran. They're fighting us with Syria.
Vote on 1973 and a whole lot of help on Iran.
We're going to move the debate to the reception, and please join me in thanking our two representatives. There's obviously lots to discuss, and it's going to be an interesting fall.
Okay, before you all run off, can I ask Jessica Field to come down? Oh, here you are. And Michael Kelly. Mike, thank you for being my co-MC. Jessica, who many of you may have met, She's the editor-in-chief of our International Law Journal. There will be lengthy articles, in some cases, written about all of these speeches. And so in about 8 months, you can read much more detail with footnotes about what these folks have in mind. I want to thank again this final panel for ending on such a great note, and Betsy for putting it together and organizing it. And one last thing. Can I ask the speakers to give an applause to the audience, which is a little different than normal, but you guys have been terrific.